Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our sort of panel discussion on Vedanta for critical times. Today we're going to have an interesting discussion with some eminent speakers and our moderators. So first of all, can everybody hear me okay in the Zoom world? All right, great. All right, wonderful. Let's start off with a chant as a way to sort of prepare ourselves, cool our minds, and engage in a wonderful discussion. If you know the chant, chant along. Om Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritam Gamaya Avir Avir Maiti Rudra Yakte Dakshina Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam Tenamam Pahi Nityam Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. O Lord, shine through and through, and ever protect us with thy loving, compassionate face. Om, peace, peace, peace to all beings everywhere. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for coming today. This is both a online and in-person retreat here in San Diego, California. And today is an auspicious time of the year for us in the Hindu tradition. It is Durga Puja, where we celebrate the divine feminine, the divine mother is celebrated. We're actually in the midst of Durga Puja itself. And also, in the Jewish tradition, Maitri, what is it also?
It's Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah.
Happy New Year.
It's the New Year tradition also. So it's going to really sort of uplifting spiritual energies coming on our way. And as we also know, it's an important time. It's a time that many different things are happening in the world. And it seems like there's crisis all around us. It's a critical time. We have elections coming up. So today, the reason for having this discussion is how do we engage in discussions where we don't end up feeling angry with one another? How can we listen, understand, and have compassion for people we don't see eye to eye with? How can we get a broader perspective and understand the needs that may not get met by people, and try to understand those needs? How can we hold a loving, compassionate space for others, but yet remain true to our own calling? So, when the chaos is coming all around us, how can we be centered and tuned to our own inner self? So these are things that we're going to be talking about today. How to see the world from a spiritual point of view. How to cleanse our own minds so we can see things as they are, not be so charged up. In order to help us do this, we have three eminent speakers from around the United States that we're really privileged to have with us today. So I'd like to introduce each of these speakers first before we begin. The first speaker I'd like to introduce is Swami Sarvapriyananda ji. He's coming from New York. There's Swami Sarvapriyananda ji. Swami Sarvapriyananda is probably the most well-known Swami in our Vedantic order. He's the minister and spiritual leader of the Vedanta Society of New York, which was the first Vedanta center created by Swami Vivekananda. He joined the Ramakrishna Order in 1994 and received his sannyas in 2004, and was initiated by revered Swami Bhuteshananji Maharaj. He is the most well-known speaker in Advaita Vedanta in our order, and is popularly known as the YouTube Swami. Why? Because of his many viral lectures. And I said this in our retreat we had previously, that do you know what a virus does? It infects the host and destroys the host. In the same sense, I wonder if Swami's job is to infect us with his knowledge and destroy our ignorance. This is Swami Sarvapriyananda. Swami, you're so honored and privileged to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The next person we have coming is Dr. Elon Goldstein. He's a lecturer in Buddhist studies. He was my lecturer at Harvard Divinity School, and he also teaches at Brandeis University. He's a scholar, teacher in a number of interrelated academic fields. The comparative study of religions, South Asian religions like Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions, East Asian religions like Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian traditions. He teaches religion and literature, especially with regards to Asian literatures. He's the emerging field of contemporary spirituality, psychology, and higher human developmental frameworks informed by social sciences. Within the aforesaid areas, one of Goldstein's particular long-standing interests is the comparative study of meditation, of contemplation in mystical practices, also of religious and cultural technologies meant for transforming individuals and communities, past and present. His other interests include the study of shamanic practices of indigenous people, as well as Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Taoist approaches for positively constructing person society. So it is with our honor that we have with us Dr. Elon Goldstein, who's coming to us from Boston. He was my professor in Buddhist studies in Harvard, and Swami, Dr. Elon Goldstein, we're so honored to have you. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Swami. That was a mouthful, but thank you.
And finally, here in San Diego is one of our local, known, loved speakers, friends. He's Peter Bolland. He's a professor of philosophy and humanities at Southwestern College and the chair of both. He teaches world religions, Asian philosophy, world mythology, and ethics for the past 32 years. Off campus, he speaks at many places, especially at the Oasis and Unitary Church. He writes, teaches. He's also a singer and teaches a wide range of topics from spiritual to philosophical things. He writes in a column for Unity magazine. He publishes a blog called Thinking Through, where all his published writings are gathered. He leads guided meditations online on the Insight Timer meditation app. He has a YouTube channel called Peter Bolland TV, where he posts videos and talks of current things that he's doing. All his lectures are for, I think, one specific purpose: shaping the insights of the world's wisdoms, traditions into tools we can use to enrich our lives. He recently wrote and published a book called The 7 Stone Path, an everyday journal to wisdom, which looks at key concepts from all spiritual traditions and how to embody them. We are so fortunate today to have with us Professor Peter Bolland. Thank you, Professor Peter Bolland. Thank you so much. So in order to make this happen, we thought what we're going to do is we are going to take the first 90 minutes. I've asked the speakers if they can be here for 2 hours. Maybe Swami Sarvapriyananda has to leave earlier, but we're going to try to have the whole 2 hours to utilize this time. And what we're going to do is for the 90 minutes, our moderator is going to ask the speakers questions. We're going to encourage the speakers to have dialogue amongst each other, to unpeel the layers of the various questions we're going to ask. Another thing I want to also tell you is that sometimes in these discussions, someone's telling me that they can be politically charged. One of the things in Vedanta, which I respect, is the ability to look at viewpoints from other people's opinions and to still stay focused. This should be an opportunity where we can all express our own viewpoint, knowing it's coming from a particular certain loci, and have space to accept that viewpoint, to embrace it. So I'm going to, and then also, we're going to learn tools as well as how to not get so charged up when we're hearing certain things. I invite you, as we're listening to the speakers, to see what is happening within each of you. Do a little research project. Where do you feel tightness occurring? Where do you feel yourself tightening up? In what particular part of your body? Why are you tightening up? Why are you reacting the way we're reacting? What is this charge coming from? From our conditioning. Is there a way you can relax into it and open space to it to be able to hear and understand and clearly, and just be like the Divine Mother, Holy Mother? One of her great virtues was she held space for everybody, no matter who came, from what ethnicity to what religious point of view to whatever you were. She held space as the Divine Loving Mother because everybody is a child of the Divine Mother. That's the meaning of Durga Puja. So I invite you to and encourage you to just listen into your own body and see what you're experiencing yourself. Remember, we are today like Arjuna in the battlefield of the Kurukshetra. We have Krishna coming as these three speakers to us, trying to guide us and now navigate us through these difficult and challenging times. Each one of them is going to speak something differently to each one of you. You're going to receive it differently. Try to gather that information and see what the divine is telling you today. In order to do this, we're going to have three moderators. My name is Swami Sarvapriyananda. I'm one of the moderators. We're going to have Maitri over on my left-hand side. She's a longtime devotee, a teacher, and is also up on a lot of the current things that are happening. And we're also going to have Tejas, who is currently in South Korea, studying Korean. The whole purpose is to have a panel which has a monastic, a householder, and a millennial. We want to get different opinions here. So we are going to look at different spectrums and different ways of seeing things. And so to make this possible now, first I'm going to have Maitri introduce us into the current times, and then we will ask questions, and I may direct the question to someone in the beginning, and then I encourage a panel discussion. If you want to make a point, maybe you can just raise your hand, and then I can see you on the monitor here, all right? So Maitri, would you like to sort of take us into like what's happening today?
All right. No, I'm not going to give you a newscast. I was sitting here thinking, if you want to make somebody's face wrinkle up like they're eating a lemon, just say the word politics. So it's politics season. And indeed, this is a politics season like most of us have never experienced before. It seems like it's been going on for 10 years, but it's definitely getting heated up. Whether we wish to engage in it or not, it's in our faces. Not only from the left, the right, the middle, but also from media, advertising, tables on the streets with signs, lawn signs, everybody vying for our attention. So what we're doing today, to me, is kind of a follow-up to a similar panel we did back in June at a retreat. And it was kind of putting our toe in the water. It was we gently broached the topic of politics for a panel of spiritual experts. Swami Sarvapriyananda ji was one of them. And we had a lot of people there, so I went and talked to a lot of people about their reaction, and they really welcomed it and even wished that we got to get a little more frank and ask some more. In fact, the biggest queries that I found people had and wanted to talk about were a broad, how can we be so divided and yet be in the truth that we are one? And more specifically, this one surprised me. People were upset by being lied to a lot, and they wanted to really hear about how do you face that. So no, we're not here today to help you figure out who to vote for or which side is right. If you were thinking that was going to happen, well, that's not. We have some of everybody in every room that we enter, but we would like to hear from some wise scholars and practitioners how you manage being in the situation we're all in, whether we choose to be or not. So.
Thank you, Maitri. So for the first topic we're going to do, we have this broken into 4 different topics. First topic we're going to look at is how to view the political world. And I have a question here. We're going to put this question up on the screen so everybody can see it and read it as well, and I'll just read along. There is something in the nature of embodiment that seems to necessitate struggle and conflict. The nature of the world is struggle, competition, and duality. This is actually a quote from Peter Bolland in one of his past talks. First question is this so? Is this the nature of the world? And if so, can there ever be peace and harmony in the world? So I'd like to begin with maybe with Peter Bolland. Since this is your quote, I'd like to have you start off with this, and I'll tell the speakers also, however way you want to steer the conversation, please do so. And also just for the people on Zoom, for speakers, just raise your hand so we can see when you want to talk, okay? Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Swami. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's an honor to be on this panel with everyone in this beautiful space and across the world. It's fantastic. So I don't remember saying that, first of all. No, just I absolutely did say that. And as a professor at a community college, I have the honor and privilege of teaching 19 to 24-ish brand new college students trying college out. They didn't go to a 4-year out of high school. They said, let's try the local neighborhood community college, and they're very interested in Is it loud enough?
Is this working?
Yeah, it seems to
It's
be.
not working. Did you unmute it?
I did, and then it kind of went away after that. Maybe the battery died.
No, hold on.
I turn this off. Oh, good. I can start over. I get a rewrite on my whole thing.
There you are.
Thank you. Anyway, I was just saying, and I'll do it more briefly. I teach at a community college, so I get to work with a lot of students who are not familiar with almost all of this stuff. And so when we work through the Bhagavad Gita and we're studying the Vedanta or the Hindu tradition, I'm just really moved by this juxtaposition that story takes us into. Namely, on one hand, there is a timeless, changeless, eternal reality that we are all a part of, that we are all emanations of. Oh, and also, we're in a battlefield, and if you don't fight, a bunch of people are going to get hurt, and if you do fight, a bunch of other people are going to get hurt. And it seems to me in the metaphor, and this is through the lens of Gandhi's analysis of the Bhagavad Gita, of course, that the Bhagavad Gita is the kind of this perfect metaphor of this confusing truth that we are both part of one changeless, peaceful, divine, boundless reality, and at the same time we find ourselves in the so-called battlefield of trying to survive as embodied forms. And as Krishna says at one point, our nature drive us to action. I need water. I need air. I need food. I need my family to be safe. And if someone's going to come and try to take my water and take my food and and poison the air and harm my family, it is my dharma, it is my sacred purpose to defend them. And that's where it gets ethically confusing. And so the challenge now becomes, and I think the Gita is ultimately all about this, how to be in the field of action without attachment to the fruits, but still courageous enough to say, I'm not going to run away and hide. It is just as foolish to act evilly as it is to abstain from action. Those are both forms of escapism from your sacred responsibility. So in that sense, it seemed for all the householders in my community college classroom who are probably never going to take another philosophy class in their life, but they are going to go out and raise families, they are going to work, they are going to compete, their restaurant is going to compete against the other restaurants, they're going to navigate difficult political landscapes like the one we have here, in this country, in this world today. So those seem to me to be eminently practical thought experiments that are necessary to do, so that when you find yourself in a conflict, you have some skills to touch back on.
Thank you, Peter. Would anybody like to respond to that? Swami Sarvapriyananda, what about the idea that is the world a dog's curly tail? No matter what we do, it just bends back in the same position. Will there ever be peace and harmony in the world?
Well, first of all, I just want to start with a caveat. When Swami Harinamanji proposed this particular panel and the discussion, my first reaction was that this is a really bad idea. And I'll tell you why. He gets wonderful ideas for multiple programs, which we have seen over the last so many years, each better than the last one. But this time, I think he came up with a stinker. That requires some nuance. Let me just say why. The main reason is, the big caveat is, we as an order of monks in the Ramakrishna Order, the Vedanta monks, which the order we belong to, we are very strictly, can you hear me? Is this clear?
No, we can hear you, Mark. We just want to increase the volume in our particular area here.
Okay. So in our order, we are strictly non-political. And this is the norm in our order. We do not get involved in politics in India, in other countries where we operate. And this is a principle that is observed very carefully from the very beginning of our order. So that's one side of it. And I think that's a very good principle to stick to, especially for a monastic order. But having said that, the nuance is here. Is then the subject which we have got, Vedanta for critical times, applying Eastern philosophy to difficult political times, is this invalid? Can we not apply these principles to politics? No, it's entirely valid. I remember when Mahatma Gandhi was famously accused of doing religion in politics. He said, he was unapologetic. He said, the two most powerful forces for human good that I know are religion and politics. And therefore, as long as I live, I shall not cease to do religion in politics and politics in religion. So it is entirely applicable. In a deeper metaphysical sense, it has to be applicable. Eastern philosophy has to be applicable. Look at it from an Advaitic perspective. The central teaching of Advaita is oneness, that there is only one reality. This world and whatever be its ultimate spiritual reality, they are one reality. It's not that there is a separate God and heaven and a separate world. There is this one reality which we are experiencing. So there cannot be a complete divorce between spirituality, spiritual principles, philosophies, and the mundane world. There cannot be a complete split between the spiritual and the sacred and the secular. There cannot be. If you do that, it's to the detriment of both. Now, coming to the particular question which Harinamanji asked, is this the real nature of the world? Conflict, peace? Is it the nature, is it the apparent nature of the world? I'm now answering it from an Advaitic perspective. Is it the apparent experience nature of the world, that there is duality, there is conflict, there is change, there is trouble, there is dissatisfaction? Yes, and 100 times yes. Our experience tells us all the time. Is that the real nature of the world? No. The real nature of the world in Advaita Vedanta is one limitless spiritual existence. Oneness, not division. A reality which is changeless, not in terms of changelessness through time, but beyond time and space. One spiritual reality which we call Brahman, existence, consciousness, bliss. There is no conflict. There is no trouble. There is unbroken and unbreakable peace. And further, the link is here. Vedanta says, you are that ultimate reality. And indeed, everything else that we experience is that ultimate reality, and it's already an accomplished fact. It's not something that you have to work towards and then the problem is that we do not experience it that way. We do not seem to know it. It seems very theoretical, not at all the truth. And therefore, we have to investigate what we experience in the light of the texts like the Upanishads, and then realize that we are not uh, just this body and mind. We are not just this world of turmoil and war and politics and um, you know lack of peace, but in depth, our real nature is this one existence consciousness bliss. So the answer to the second part of the question, will there ever be peace in the world? The answer is a qualified no. There will not be peace in the world. It's a dog's curly tail. You cannot, nobody has straightened it out till now, and you cannot. That's the very nature of the world. However, that does not mean that you cannot attain to peace. You can. In fact, all the enlightened beings who ever lived in any spiritual tradition, all the Mahatmas and the Jivan Muktas and the Bodhisattvas and all the masters, they all lived in this world. And living in this world, they claim to have attained freedom from turmoil and conflict. So enlightenment is possible. And as far as the world is concerned, this trouble and strife and turmoil, from a spiritual perspective, it can be managed. It can be much better than it is now. There can be no permanent solution to it. It can be much better, and it will get worse again, and then you have to manage it again, a future generation. You can do things which will make it worse. You can do things which will make it better.
Thank you, Swamiji. Dr. Goldstein, would you like to respond in any way?
Thank you. Yes. And again, I just want to say thanks for including me. And I see that on Zoom, we have 115 people, and then there are more people there live. So there's a great deal of collective wisdom here and life experience, spiritual experience, not only among those of us who happen to be speaking at the moment, but among all of us. So I hope in the questions and answers, a lot of that collective knowledge can come out even more. And a little bit similar to Swami Sarvapriyananda, I want to just back up one step before I begin to answer the immediate question, and say that a couple of things. First of all, there's a freshness here because we, at least myself, and I think all of us as panelists, we were aware of the general topic from the flyer, but we weren't aware of any of these specific questions. So we get to address them freshly, just so that everyone knows that. And then secondly, so that my perspective is a little clearer, I want to say all of the things that Swami mentioned in his intro about me, I would throw aside, and I would just say this, that where I'm coming from is as a student of Dharma traditions for 35 plus years, similar to many of you in the audience, someone who is very much a student and a practitioner in training. And that also, I'm a single parent who's raising two daughters and in a busy, bustling household full of dogs and cats and kids running around. And just to make that clear, like where I'm coming from, I'm also a former school teacher. Those are the things that seem most relevant to just frame what I'm about to say. So I very much agree with what both Peter and Swami have said, and I just want to add a few nuances there. And mostly I'm going to try to speak from the perspective of Indian Mahayana Buddhism to give a slightly different wrinkle, but it's very consonant with what's already been said. Okay. I also teach Hinduism, and I teach about Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda in my classes, and I revere them and love them. And so firstly, I'd like to say that, when I do teach Sri Ramakrishna, one of the things that comes across each time to me and to the students who encounter him for the first time is this spaciousness of heart, this accommodating spirit, all inclusive, like the sky, where distinctions that we tend to get hung up on, he wasn't hung up on, right? And so that I'm hearing that sort of spaciousness is a desired quality from everything that's been said. And it seems to me that we need to be aware as spiritual practitioners not to fight a political battle or a war inside of ourselves, right? If we want to tap into and fall into this sort of spaciousness exemplified by Sri Ramakrishna a tiny bit more, one of the key things is that we don't start fighting political wars internally in our own hearts and minds, meaning when things arise within us, jealousy, pettiness, arising of self-image and ego, there are ways to relate to that that are taught in the Vedantic traditions and elsewhere that will allow fixation and stuckness on that sort of irritation or jealousy or ego-centeredness to loosen and dissolve. And that's what we want. And there's a different way to relate to what's going on inside of ourselves where we start to shut it out like we do to other people whose opinions and viewpoints we can't tolerate. And we start to say, that's not acceptable to have those kinds of thoughts, those kinds of feelings. And then we're in a political battleground in our own hearts as we go around daily life. So how surprising is it that we then tend to get easily activated, reactive, and in conflict with others because we're reactive to ourselves? So that was one thing I wanted to emphasize. And then I'll stop, but just to say that I think there's much more to elaborate on with what Swami was just talking about this absolute ultimate side where we can and need to realize that we're not at risk. We're not ultimately this fragile body and mind that's at risk. We are inseparable and we're also free. So there's both an inseparability with what's appearing and a freedom on our own side. And so how to enact that freedom in the realm of being inseparable and inextricably always already connected in a skillful way without trying to over control and cling, right, with our egos. And how to differentiate between real wise caring and a sort of controlling, clinging of I'm going to fix this based on my small ideas. These are questions that we might want to explore. So stop there.
Thank you. Anybody?
Swami, can I jump in with a follow-up question that inspired me listening to the three of you? It occurred to me to ask, we started out by talking about how we can cope with or approach the kind of the fight that we find ourselves in, whether we wanted to join it or not. But now I wonder, can we actually use it for spiritual growth? Is this conflict and finding our center within it in the different ways that the three of you talked about, can it benefit us if we choose to work it spiritually? Does that make sense?
Work what? Is this off again? Work what spiritually?
So Peter says, works what spiritually? Work the conflict without getting caught up in the way that Dr. Goldstein was just talking about and Swami Sarvapriyananda was talking about. In other words, could there be, I always wondered if there's a positive purpose to the discomfort that we experience in these situations.
Can I, if you agree, can I chime in here?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I think she has just, hit the nail on the head because that's the whole purpose of life. The question is whether can we use this trouble and this action, the work that we do in this world, can we use it to spiritual benefit? Can we grow spiritually in the midst of all this and using all this? In fact, if you take a wider view of it, if I can quote Aurobindo here, he said, life itself is yoga. So the Vedantic view of life, including war, including politics, including suffering, including being unwise and getting knocked about in life, all of that is spiritual growth. Actually, that's the whole purpose of life. From a Vedantic perspective, the whole purpose of this life and multiple lives we are leading is spiritual growth leading us towards enlightenment. Now, do it wisely, you call it yoga, you call it the spiritual practice. Do it unwisely, get knocked about by life, then it's just living life. That's when we just pain teaches us to try to do better, both individually and at a social level. So, and straight answer to your question, I think would be certainly a wide view of spirituality shows that life itself is spirituality. Even when you think you're not being spiritual, even when you think we're just living life and and making a mess of life, that's also leading in a very long scenic route towards enlightenment.
I'll jump in here. You know, the empathetic perception of the suffering of the other in a moment of conflict, to me, that's the door that we walk through. And so, yes, the moment of conflict, the moment of suffering can be the principal trigger of deepening into the awareness of oneness. And to me, the problem of being human is to simultaneously be in that awareness of oneness and use that empathetic awareness of the suffering of others as a foundation for right action, for moral action. And to me, I have a very simplistic playground sense of morality. Is someone being harmed or not? And so when I think of ahimsa, which we usually do in English as nonviolence, I think it's much more useful, expansive, and inclusive to define it as non-harm. And so when a political system is predicated on stripping women of bodily autonomy and control over their own lives, to me, that is a political system, that is an ideology that harms people. And I believe that as a practitioner of spirituality, I have a moral duty to interrupt cruelty, to name harm, and to find nonviolent ways to dismantle structures that are ignorantly predicated on harming others in the name of some false notion of superiority or of misunderstanding of this scripture or that scripture. So there comes the political action piece, that it's not okay for me to go home and meditate all the time when other people are literally dying because of systems of oppression. And I'm most inspired by people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Protestant Christian minister in Germany during World War II, who ended up getting arrested and executed by the Nazis, but not before. He went against almost all of his other Protestant churches in Germany who were turning over their birth records. These neighborhood German churches were the place where birth records were kept. And so when the Nazi regime decided to figure out who all the Jews were, they went to these Protestant churches, and most of them turned over their birth records and were actively complicit in the Holocaust. And this is a horrible thing to think about and to consider. And then there's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, this Protestant minister whose writings are still just electrifying today. And again, it didn't work out so good for him. He was killed by the regime, but his sacrifice awakened a world. And to me, that's one of those archetypal moments of when spiritual awareness and witness and courage and selflessness all kind of come together as a model of how to be alive in the oneness of his, of course, dualistic Christian theology, and at the same time be willing to risk it all to interfere with cruelty, ignorance, and harm.
Dr. Goldstein, do you want to say anything in response?
Well, I'll say that a little bit similar to what Swami Sarvapriyananda was voicing at the beginning, I have some misgivings about framing this entire discussion in terms of politics, that it seems to me more applicable and useful and also real to our lives to frame it in terms of how we engage with the difficulties of our lives in the world, right? It's not just politics, it's life, right? It's confused, samsaric life driven by delusion and confusion and negative tendencies in us. So how do we engage with what's going on in the schools where our children are, with the mental health system that a cousin or an aunt finds themselves embedded in, with the courts and the social justice system and so on, to try to make it a little bit more just, while at the same time always working on deepening the understanding of ourselves to find a different sort of freedom. Yeah, because we can and ought to try to make the world better, but we're not going to make it into a utopia. We're not going to make it perfect, because there's negative delusion and confusion that's ruling the minds of most of us most of the time, right? And that's what needs to be addressed fundamentally, but that doesn't mean we abdicate all attempts to try to make the world better. So it seems to me a balance there, but that balance very much includes setting aside some kind of time in a way that we find useful for ourselves, drawing on all these methods coming from Vedanta to try to inquire and work on what's going on inside of ourselves to be more effective agents in our lives, whatever those situations are.
Maharaj, if I may, real quick.
Sure.
I just wanted to respond to one of the first things that Swami Sarvapriyananda ji said, sort of the question of, is it even our place to be having this discussion about politics when the Vedanta sort of policy is to not discuss politics? And I just wanted to sort of clarify like why we thought this would be a good idea. And it's not that we think that monastics should be engaging in political life necessarily, but it's more for us householders that are here in this forum, because as Maitri was saying, for us, it's not an option to not engage with it at all. And we sort of need the guidance of monastics to help us. Like the idea is not to bring the chaos of the world into the calmness of the temple, but to how can we bring the calmness of the temple into the world with us, and specifically as we engage with politics and these things that are like quite charged. So I just wanted to sort of give background as to why we thought this was a good idea. And I'm very glad that everyone decided to come, even though it didn't seem like a good idea at first.
If I may, I'd just add something to what Tejas just said.
Yes, go ahead, Swami.
So it's important to underline the fact that Swami Vivekananda was not opposed to politics. So I want to emphasize this. He was specifically, we have a norm in our monastic order for the monks individually and as an organization not to take part of in local, national, international politics. However, Swami Vivekananda had clear political ideas. And for example, Sister Nivedita, she took action for the freedom of India, and a whole generations of Indian freedom fighters, those who are fighting for freedom from colonial oppression, they all read and were inspired by Swami Vivekananda.
Thank you. And in fact, we have questions, but I'm going to sort of bypass the next question because this is leading into topic number 2, whether to engage or disengage. So Indranil, I'd like you to bring up the third slide, bypass the second slide, go to the third slide here, and I'm going to have Maitri ask this question here. It's the question is, should we engage or disengage, Indranil?
So, and you have all addressed this to an extent, but here's where the question is, and let's see if it brings up any further commentary. Should we engage or disengage with conflicts in the world, or both? If we do engage, are we foolishly buying into a world which is unreal? If we disengage, however, are we shirking our moral duty? What about the idea that when we witness an injustice and do nothing, we are complicit in the injustice? So it seems like we have addressed this, but does anybody have anything further to say about that?
Peter, go
Well,
ahead.
that's a wonderful way to frame the question. We've been already sort of teasing our way into this, haven't we? That inaction is a form of action. Again, I'm sorry to be the guy quoting the Gita all the time here, but there is action in the midst of inaction, and there is inaction in the midst of action. And so we are, in that sense, unavoidably, again, in the battlefield. I know that's a kind of a, for some, maybe a hyperbolic metaphor to describe life as a battlefield, but there's the Gita, right? And so I am personally not a warrior. I don't own a weapon. I have never had a fight in my whole life. My policy when I was a little boy is if a bully picked on me, I just ran. And I've literally never landed a punch on anybody, and I hate arguments. They make me terribly uncomfortable. Just ask my wife. I don't engage in conflict because I'm terrified of it. And so that was not what I planned to say, but that all just spilled out by way of confession and context. And so to me, one of the things we do in philosophy a lot is worry about the meanings of words. So I notice in the equivocation of language, the word me or I changes when we say I am an eternal being. I am one with the ultimate, eternal, changeless reality. And then I am in a traffic jam. You know, there's two different people there. Well, let me say it better. There are layers of identification. Of course, I identify with the oneness. And then Peter Bolland kind of becomes this diaphanous, porous form, and our oneness is experienced directly in mystical experience. But then when I am wrestling with a contemporary political challenge and what the government is deciding to do, and as others have said, as a householder, I am kind of morally obligated to wade into that struggle and to try to discern the best course of action among a lot of pretty awful options, and knowing that perfection is impossible and knowing that utopia is not the goal. How can I minimize the violence? How can I minimize the change? And when we study Gandhi in my classrooms, it's very interesting to notice that in his advocacy of the satyagraha, of ahimsa, he was no absolutist pacifist. That violence was a part of the world, and I'm going to paraphrase, you know, if a madman is running amok in your village with a sword and is dispatching people, you kill the madman. And you just put down a human being. And people who are new to Gandhi or new to nonviolence are like, oh, couldn't we negotiate our way? No, because the nonviolent thing to do is to minimize the violence. And in that very unfortunate and hopefully rare scenario, shockingly and weirdly so, you are compelled into ultimate engagement, that is taking a life. And one can still be anti-war and all of that and anti-violence in every conceivable way, but allow that in the nuanced world, as many have shared here, we can't step entirely out of the fact that in embodied form, we find ourselves in conflict. So to me, the reason I'm so interested in politics is because politics is just the word we use to talk about the methods and means by which we enact our values. So I don't know how to separate my values from my politics. I can't have deeply held convictions about ahimsa, about human rights, about non-harm to the environment. I can't do that over here and remain apolitical. I don't know what that means, but I completely support that organizations like Vedanta and others have an important way of serving the world that is enhanced by their conscious decision to not become advocates of this candidate or that policy or whatever. I think that's essential, that there be organizations like that. But again, maybe that was a really good way to put it, to say as householders, we are not bound by those restrictions.
Would anybody like to respond to that or to the question?
Should I?
Yeah,
May-
go ahead,
may-
Swami.
Yeah, just
Yes.
following on from what Peter just said. From an Advaitic perspective, both engagement and disengagement would be wrong. Now, let me explain that. When I engage in action, good action, evil action, I think I am this person and I'm different from all others, and these are my likes and desires, this is my agenda, and I'm putting it into action. Advaita Vedanta says the whole thing is based on a delusion. And if I choose to say that, no, I will not do these things, I'm going to go to a Himalayan cave and sit and meditate, I'm going to disengage, exactly what Arjuna said to Krishna when he proposed this to Krishna, that I don't want to fight this war. That also, Krishna says, is based on delusion. Notice, not doing something is also a kind of action. For example, if you ask, what are you doing? And you say, I am fasting. Now, fasting is not eating, but it takes a lot of willpower. It takes a lot of, in fact, it's a lot harder to do, quote unquote, than to eat. So, not engaging is also identification with this body-mind complex. Engagement is also identification with this body-mind complex. And therefore, Krishna said, the verse that Peter quoted, karmanya karmaya pashyet, akarmani cha karmaya, the one who sees non-action, inaction, and action in non-action. You see, from the enlightened perspective, you can be tremendously active and fully engaged, and yet claim that you are this one limitless ocean of Brahman. And from an unenlightened perspective, I can disengage. I think I'm in an ashram or in a mountain cave, and still be in the mesh of delusion, and that's also kind of engagement, a foolish kind of engagement. So yeah, this is the thing that notice people whom we regard as fully enlightened, someone like Adi Shankaracharya, or in our age, Swami Vivekananda, they were people of tremendous engagement and action. And they were busy all lifelong, as long as they lived. From our perspective, if we said, are you, we see that they are people of action. But if you ask them, Vivekananda or Shankara, they would say no. They would say, I am that's one limitless, ever peaceful Brahman.
Let me follow up on this. Marge, how does an enlightened soul see the world? How does an enlightened soul, when they're seeing all this going on, what do they view? How do they see it?
You have to ask them, but on the basis of their accounts and on the basis of texts, I think they see it exactly as we see it, plus something more, something deeper than that. We are seeing the surface, they're seeing the surface and the ocean in all its depth. So we are seeing the name and the form and the activity and taking that to be the reality. They're seeing the reality and as it is manifested as name, form, and activity. This is the difference.
Dr. Elon Goldstein?
Yeah, I was raising my hand, not because I can give that higher perspective any better than it just was, but instead to say a few words about a more ordinary perspective related to this, that when we're not established in ongoing experience of oneness or inseparability, when we're not that sort of saint, as I and most of us in the audience are not, nonetheless, I think we can take heart, because by implementing spiritual practices in a skillful way in ourselves, then we start to loosen some of the entanglements of I'm this, I have to follow this kind of perspective or this sort of irritation or get stuck and polarized into this particular view. When we learn by using our inner methods to start to lighten this and loosen this, then the intentions that tend to arise are clearer. They're more informed by a deeper knowledge and wisdom. They're a little bit more informed by our deeper nature and a little less colored and tainted just by egoic delusion. So then we can start to gradually trust our intentions a little bit more, that they're going to lead to something that is generally more positive than if, as before, they were just coming from an untrained, fully egoic, knee-jerk, reactive kind of place. And so this is why I haven't been speaking thus far about particular standpoints, you know, this particular politic or that, because it seems to me, and coming largely from the Buddhist tradition in India, that as we start to gain this deeper kind of knowledge in ourselves in an ordinary way, we're not fully awakened, we're not high bodhisattvas, we're just a little less entangled, then our action becomes more skillful. And our hearts become more open, and we become more sensitive, and we can start to really take the position of the other that we're encountering, as Peter was saying, this whole understanding how others are similar to ourselves and just being thinking, feeling, experiencing beings who want happiness and have the same kinds of structures that are imprisoning them as what we're experiencing, right? And so then there's a basis for love, compassion, and really decentering ourselves and taking much more the perspective of another, you know. But it starts with method inside. Then it's like, well, whatever the situation is and however you feel it's best to protect the environment, there's more wisdom of how to do that. It's not up to me or anyone else to specify, right? It has to come from an inner wisdom that we develop as we're learning in the world and taking action.
May I follow up with that for Dr. Goldstein? I'm going to lose my thread of thought here. Let's get really practical here for a moment. As a Buddhist practitioner yourself, let's go back to how Swami Sarvapriyananda introduced this whole thing. He asked us all to notice when something's said that tightens us up. And I get that image of the sour lemon taste, just with the word of politics. If somebody says something triggering, or your student says, I'm feeling triggered by fill in the blank, what does a Buddhist practitioner, what do you say inside your head? What do you do inside yourself, knowing that those moments will happen? What is the actual practice?
So there are so many different practices, just as there are in the Hindu tradition and in the tradition of Vedanta that's, you know, featured from the Vedanta Society. There's not just a single method or technique, and because all or the vast majority of the audience here is related, as far as I understand, mostly to the Vedanta Society, I'm not particularly interested in trying to introduce other kinds of methods. The methods that are already available taught through the Vedanta Society are more than sufficient, right, for all of our needs, it seems to me. And but there can be many methods, from working with the body immediately in that instance and learning to relax the body, because body, energy, and mind are all interrelated. So if we work with any one of those skillfully, it affects the others naturally, automatically. So if we can feel immediately, well, I'll back up one step. It seems to me with the implementation of any particular method or technique, a key principle is that we don't want to be lost in our ordinary concepts, just our ordinary story about, you know, I this and I that. So one way or another, we need to drop into a different level where we can see through that story and not be trapped in it as the end all be all. Whether we're working with the body or we're working with thoughts and emotions in some way, or prayer and visualization, or devotion, or just simple realization of directly seeing the nature of experience in that moment as insubstantial, and that there already is an awareness that's free, that's present, you know, that we are, that we don't have to do something to get there. But that's subtle. So many times we need something that's not so subtle, because it's not always accessible to us when we're in the grip of some thought or emotion. So It can be relaxing the body and the energy. It can be praying. It can be, as long as we're not fighting a war inside of ourselves and pushing something away where we create a split in the heart. Then we're like the people fighting political wars or other wars. We're just doing it to ourselves. So many methods. I mean, to look, where is the thought, where's the thinker of the thought, what's the mind, and not finding the substantial small thing that we thought was there, and therefore landing in automatically what we already are, this bigger awareness and consciousness that Peter and Swami Sarvapriyananda have been speaking of.
I would address it with your excellent question with just one word: renunciation. To fall out of love with my own opinion, to fall out of love with my own reaction, and when I feel that triggering anger or that opposition rising up, just to let go of that. That's not who I really am. That's not ultimately true or even real. So that, on the heels of what Dr. Goldstein just mentioned, that softening, and that can be rather instantaneous, to renounce and enjoy, as Gandhi summed up the Isha Upanishad. Those three words have gotten me out of a lot of pickles.
Swami, would you like to mention any simple Vedantic technique, how not to get caught up in the narrative of our own internal stories?
Muted.
You're muted, Swami. You're muted.
And not necessarily simple ones, but certain principles which might
Sure.
help. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
One would be the essence of karma yoga, selfless, not selfish. That's a good principle. If I am genuinely committed to peace in this world, it always helps to be more selfless rather than selfish. It's a spectrum. Then the second one would be devotion, not desire. That's, I think, the essence of bhakti yoga. Whatever be our particular devotional tradition, Shakta, Shaiva, Vaishnava, Christian, Islamic, Jewish, cultivation of deep love for the divine. When the heart is full of love, generally hatred, dissension, conflict, they find no space there. The two cannot coexist. There's a caveat. It's often the most devotional, emotional kind of spiritual paths which are also can lead to hatred and intense dislike of the other, because it's the same emotion which flips between love and hate. So that has to be guided, so that our love flows to the divine and it's not, using the divine to fight with others. The third practice would be the essence of Raja Yoga, which is concentration, not distraction. Often, when there is conflict, dissension, fights, our minds are flickering. There's a direct connection between external violence, external conflict, and inner conflict, inner restlessness. So the inner stillness leads to peace externally. One monk put it very beautifully. He said, "We think it is because of the troubles of samsara that my mind is troubled." He says, no, quite counterintuitively. It is because your mind is troubled that you find samsara outside. So these three principles. Another thing, let me just say, following on what Peter said about renunciation, one of my favorite passages in the Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis is where Jesus asks the disciple, or the disciple asks Jesus, "How do I find peace?" And Jesus says, "My son, if you want peace, you must do these four things." And if you look at these four things, we immediately realize why we don't have peace. First, always seek to have less rather than more. There's a big one right there. Second, always seek to be last rather than first. And third, always seek to do the opinion of the other rather than your own. And the last one, in all things, see and accept the will of God. All four things, very difficult. Less rather than more, last rather than first, the opinions of others rather than your own, and the will of God in everything that you see. Now, I must add here the caveat again that Thomas à Kempis was a monk. It was actually more practical. In fact, that's what a monk is supposed to do. It's not all that easy when you are in the world, you are part of a political party, you're part of a military, for example. Not so, you can't say do these things exactly, and may not be appropriate to do these things exactly also.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Swamiji. All right, so let us dive into our third question. You're Tejas, I think you were going to ask this question.
We skipped to 3. Will we do 2?
No, we're going to.
Oh, okay.
So Ramana Maharshi said that your own self-realization is the greatest service you can render the world. And we wanted to ask, is this something that you agree with, that your own self-realization is a great service to the world? And if yes, how? How is that a service to humanity? And how do you know if focusing on your own self-realization, you are doing that to realize this service, or if you're doing it like Peter Bolland was saying, if you're doing it out of fear of conflict? So that is the question. How is self-realization the greatest service you can render the world?
Anybody like to give this a shot?
I will go first. I think that's medicine for the disease of the mistaken notion that if I'm taking precious time to cloister myself away from the political arena, the so-called battlefield of life, to read and to study and to pray and to meditate and to go to retreats and take hours out of a perfectly good Saturday to do stuff like this, while people are out there suffering and we're safe. Is that okay? And I think he's offering that medicine to that question. Yes, that cultivating your own spiritual enrichment, deepening, education, however you want to call it, is the greatest gift you can give to the world. The greatest gift you can give to the world, the greatest contribution you can make to world peace is to show up more awake, slightly more awake, less entangled. As Dr. Goldstein was putting it, this isn't about perfection. It's like either I'm enlightened or why bother? It's never that. And it's always, as in our moral struggles and our political struggles, it's how can we move the needle? Dr. King's famous line that the moral arc of history bends toward justice. And this is a beautiful image. And he didn't come up with the language, he got it from somebody in the 19th century, but President Obama loved it so much, he had it sewn into the rug in the Oval Office of the White House for the 8 years that he was there, that the moral arc of history bends toward justice. And I would say, and it is we who must do the bending. And we don't get to enjoy, we're planting trees whose shade we will never rest beneath and whose fruit we will never taste. We're working long term here, not for setting everything right in one election cycle. And so with that that timelessness perspective, it seems to me that there is time, and in fact it's necessary for us to be more effective in our ethical moral actions, to be more, and I'll just shorthand it by saying more awake. And so I don't think you can have one without the other. So I think that's a powerful thing. We've been talking all morning really about the balance between these two impulses. And I would maybe even suggest a third way of framing that, not as either or, but as both and. Let's do both and more. The via media in Latin, the middle way, the middle path, means we're drawing energy from both our own personal spiritual work and our awakening to the suffering of others and our decisiveness to act. And we're bringing those things together. and we're following the path that comes out of that synthesis. That's, I think, that's the hat trick we're all trying to do.
Would Swami or Dr. Goldstein like to respond or add anything to this?
I'll go because I just want to add a footnote to what Peter said about being more awake in spiritual life and in our engagement with the world. So I was reminded of Thich Nhat Hanh, who wrote the classic Miracle of Mindfulness. He passed away, I think, last year. He passed on. So in his early years in Europe, and those were the years of the, what was it called? The Greenpeace movement, the activism against nuclear weapons there, stationed in Europe. A very noble cause indeed, but Thich Nhat Hanh said, I noticed how angry the peace activists were, and they didn't see any contradiction in it because it was a righteous anger and indignation. But he said there's a deep contradiction in that. So mindfulness, inner peacefulness, when you are engaged in activism for peace. I'm also reminded of Martin Luther, the earlier Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, whom he just quoted, who was engaged in a kind of a religious conflict for most of his life. He's kicked off the whole Protestant revolution. And I am reminded of something he says, that every day I spend an hour on my knees praying before he starts his very, very busy schedule of giving talks and writing and engaging with different parts of the Christian world in Europe at that time. And he says, the day I have no time at all, that day I spend an extra hour on my knees praying. So that shows us the importance of spiritual practice in the midst of a life of service, of engagement. However, Tejas might say here that this is an easy response. Do we need spiritual practice? Does spiritual practice make our life of engagement and service better? Yes, it does. That's like almost a no-brainer, especially in company like this. We all do spiritual practices. But Tejas might push it further and say that, how about just spiritual practice and just self-enlightenment and no connection with the world, no overt service activity? Is that still service? If I do just my private, personal spiritual practices and nothing else with the world, the bare minimum, is that still a service? Swami Vivekananda, who was all for engagement, his definition of spirituality was your own self-enlightenment and service to the world. That's the motto of our order. This same Swami Vivekananda said, if a person, yogi, sits in a Himalayan cave and meditates and he attains enlightenment and thinks 5 great thoughts, don't think that they are wasted. They will live on, they will penetrate through the stone walls of the cave and find, means of expression somewhere in the world, somewhere. That's also service. Just bearing witness to the fact spirituality is real, enlightenment is real, God realization is real, is great, great, great service.
Dr. Goldstein, would you like to add anything?
Please, yes, a few things. That if we are wondering, about the balance, how much should I leave aside my ordinary engagements and really go into long-term retreat as opposed to, a 3-week or a 1-month or 6-month retreat or something, but really more extensively. Even get to that point, there are certain questions that we can usefully ask as we're practicing in daily life to check our motivation. Because if a person is prepared to really do this intensive spiritual practice and has the right motivation and open-heartedness, it's going to have the benefit that Swami just described. But for myself and for many of us, it might not have the same benefit because our motivation might be a little more self-serving, as the question was indicating, right? That there's fear, there's tiredness, there's I don't want to put up with it all, and that's part of the motivation. So we can start to ask ourselves about the openness of our hearts, the love, the compassion, and that if we're so triggered and annoyed and irritated of needing to do A, B, and C in our daily lives, then maybe our motivation is not quite ripe, but if we're able to see through the heaviness of the circumstances of our everyday life, and our hearts are deeply open with a tenderness and palpable warm feeling for others, and we feel called to go deeper, well, then maybe that's something more to explore. And just along those lines, I want to add that compassion can really break us open. And if we don't engage sufficiently, if we don't care enough, we don't give that compassion a chance. But really encountering the suffering of those around us for whom we care can radically reshape the egoic desire in us. If not eradicate it, lessen it greatly and really shift our motivation. So we can do ourselves a disservice by tuning out too quickly, too much, as opposed to really letting our hearts break. The danger of letting our hearts break open is that we burn out, right? And that's where the ultimate side that was spoken about previously is so key, that at the same time that we're caring and allowing our hearts to be vulnerable, we need to be cultivating in that daily practice some kind of movement toward our deeper, truer nature, because then we won't burn out.
Yeah, I'm loving where the discussion is going. Just one quick thing, or maybe two, that as a white kid growing up in the suburbs of Southern California, and from not a religious family, my first exposure to the concept of monasticism was when I was 10 years old and I saw The Sound of Music. And I thought, what is this place where these women are in these long gowns? And the Julie Andrews character who's bouncing in and out of this place. And at one time, she goes back to the monastery after an unpleasant experience at the Von Trapp house, and the Mother Superior just asks her, and I'm paraphrasing, are you running towards something or are you running away from something? The monastery is not a place where you get to hide from the world and hide from trouble. So I'm one of those nerds that watches that movie every chance I get and sings along with it. But I don't know how y'all feel about Deepak Chopra. He's a kind of a lightning rod cultural figure, but that's another way that many of us outside of the Hindu tradition first start to hear about things like meditation. I remember he was talking to a student at a talk once, and the student said, I'm so busy, I don't have time to meditate. How much should I meditate? And he said, once a day. Sorry, I blew the bit. You should meditate every day. You should meditate once a day. And she said, but I'm too busy. And then he said, oh, well then you should meditate twice a day. And it's that same idea that you were talking about, the Martin Luther bit too, that if I don't spend in his tradition an hour on my knees, then I'm much less effective in the whole rest of my life.
Thank you. At this point, I want to ask one last question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And I'd like to go to Tejas' last question here. So Indranil, the very last question, because this is sort of leading into this very last question. So not that one. It is, we have the sacred purpose.
Yeah, there it is.
It was the one before.
We have this sacred purpose role to play.
There it is.
There it is.
Yeah, this is it. Okay. Go ahead, Tejas.
Yeah, so this is another quote from Peter Bolland, that we have the sacred purpose role to play. When we perform actions of our purpose, our dharma, it is not us acting, it is Brahman moving through us. When you act from the self or the ego, there are all these karmic repercussions. And the question is, how do I know who, whether it's my ego or my higher self, is acting when I choose to act in the world? How do I keep my ego from getting involved and co-opting my efforts? For example, like in movements that say that they're about God, but they're actually causing harm. And I also want to tie this into something that Swami Sarvapriyananda ji said earlier, where both engaging and disengaging is like when you choose not to do something, that is still a choice. So then do you just let yourself be led by the forces around you? And how do you know that you're not going to be led by movements that say they're about God, but they're actually causing harm? So that's the question.
Thank you. This is our last. I'd like to have every speaker address this question. So Peter, since this was something you quoted, maybe we'll have you start off first. And then...
Okay, that was a good question. Just kidding. I don't know where y'all found these, in a talk I did maybe, or in my book, but thank you for spotlighting that. That's something I sit with quite a bit, the difficulty of discerning when I am full of moral outrage and I'm about to take action, and as many of the panelists have already touched on, how can I be sure that I am not just engaged in a kind of selfish, competitive, egotistic, I know better than you, and you're a fool, and I'm up here on the mountain with all my insight, and let me show you how it's done. You know, how do I know I'm not being that guy, and how do I discern what might be arising from, again, back to the Gita, this idea that I think it's in chapter 3, that when you perform the action of your dharma, of your sacred duty, that is Brahman working through you. And it's that same thing in the St. Francis prayer, God, make me an instrument through which you work. And so people in dualistic, theistic religions like Christianity will say things like, God, use me. You know, tell me that famous Michael Judge prayer, the friar who was killed in 9/11, the chaplain for the fire department of New York was killed at the base of the first tower that fell. The famous prayer they found in his pocket, you know, God, take me where you want me to go. Tell me what you want me to see. Tell me what you want me to say, and keep me out of your way. So that and Roman Catholicism is not my tradition, but when I say that prayer in the car, in the parking lot, at my job, silently to myself, before I walk to my faculty office and all the meetings and all the students and all the unplanned absurdity that happens in all of our days, to have that in the back of my mind, let me be the presence of the infinite, not in some grandiose way like, I'm going to be that presence because nobody else is, because everybody else is. And I want to like tap into that, if for only this reason, I'm exhausted from carrying it all. I don't want any more anxiety. I want to let all of that go. Let me just be one note in this symphony. And so in that sense, the medicine for the problem is kind of right there. And it's that one word again, renunciation. I need less Peter Bolland right here. And I need more of the nameless mystery that everything is.
Thank you. Dr. Goldstein, you were tapping into this question in your previous thing. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, maybe I'll be a little more controversial, perhaps. But it seems to me, just speaking from whatever I know, all of these intentions that we've been talking about, and intentions to serve and become a vessel, all of this is good. It points us in the right direction. It's entirely good, but I do want to say it's not enough. Like in terms of the question, if we really get down to it, mind is very tricky, like samsaric mind. So we need, on the one hand, rigorous introspection, to really be honest with ourselves and always look, and ask what is going on. But then we need to utilize the mirrors of the people around us. They function like mirrors, and they can show us what we're not wanting to see about ourselves. So we think that our intention is so good in a particular situation, we're coming from a good place. But sometimes the mirrors of other people around us, if we're tuned in enough, show us, no, there was something really mixed about our motivation, and it had very mixed results, and it wasn't as pure as we thought. So this is another point about whether we're in the monastery, or I used to be a monk, by the way, so monasteries are not unfamiliar to me, right? I also was a student of Thich Nhat Hanh for some time, just as an aside. But whether we're in the monastery or whether we're out in daily life, people around us can show us our motivation if we're not hiding from that. And then finally, there needs to be methods that we utilize from Vedanta or whatever our tradition, so that increasingly awareness or pure consciousness can become disentangled from being only lost in the bubble or the little entrapment of particular thoughts and emotions. Really, I would say, if we're acting out of thoughts and emotions, no matter how noble, there isn't pure wisdom or knowledge there. Pure wisdom or knowledge it's actually, jhana is non-conceptual, and you can't put words to it. Now, we don't necessarily just jump right there. There needs to be a process of detachment, of disidentification that we've been talking about. But it just, it starts with ability to not let every passing impulse grab us and then we act it out. So to really hold ourselves to a high standard, we want action to be coming from a deep place that is spontaneous, and it's just not premeditated by ego. Most of the time we're not there, so we need to just check our intention.
Thank you. Swami Sarvapriyananda.
First, Tejas' reference to that verse of whether you engage or disengage, seeing action in inaction and inaction in action, both, I mean, if you engage from an identification with body-mind, and if you disengage from an identification body-mind, both are out of ignorance. The point of that is not that then we give up all volition and agency and be led by an organization or a movement. That's even worse. The point of that verse is that we engage in self-inquiry to find out what we truly are, that we are not truly this body-mind. And then you can engage with through the body-mind with the world, or you may not even engage with the world through the body-mind. In both cases, you are fine because you are acting from reality. But now the more practical question about how do we know that what we are doing is truly spiritual, it's coming from God, or is it coming from the ego? Well, there are some principles that Swami Vivekananda suggested, just criteria you can apply and check. One is, what I'm about to do, is it more selfless or is it selfish? The more selfish it is, the more likely it is to be from the ego. And the more selfless it is, the more likely it is to be from the divine or for a higher purpose. The second principle is, does that make you stronger or weaker? He said that which makes you stronger, morally, even physically, emotionally, morally, intellectually, and spiritually. I'm paraphrasing here. That is likely to be spiritual. That which makes us weaker, he says, reject it as poison. Anything that weakens us from physically, morally, intellectually, emotionally, and up to spiritually, reject it as poison. Third, he said that which makes for oneness, unity, that is likely to be true. That is coming from the truth. That which fractures and divides us, that is likely to be coming from falsehood. So these are, these are what you might call them heuristics. These are not absolute. Don't make don't be fanatical about these principles. We should apply them intelligently and see our actions where they fall.
Thank you, everybody. Wonderful. I now want to request our audience to go ahead and ask questions by raising your hand. So if you're in Zoom, just go to the bottom, I believe, reactions, hit and raise hand. And in our live audience here, if you have a question, just raise your hand as well.
Zoom, there's already a few people with their hands raised. I don't know if you want to take turns or how you want to do it.
We'll take turns first. So let's have one from the live audience and then from Zoom here, okay? So Ananda, why don't you come over here and just ask the question here in this one here, so they can see you also. No, come behind me.
Yes.
Oh, he's got his own
Are you good? Okay, speak. Come over here.
This is in regards to the sacred purpose. I just wanted to add something. I heard this is also a Christian prayer, and the prayer went that Lord, give me the strength to change the things I can, and the wisdom to realize the things that I cannot change. So it kind of resonated, with the sacred purpose part of the discussion. So that's actually my question is, how do we know that the things that I can change and the things that I cannot change? Sometimes, it can be a little confusing. So that's my question.
Wonderful. That comes from the Reinhold Niebuhr prayer, a great Protestant theologian that was then adopted by the 12-step movement, of course, and maybe the quick answer is we can't know. That's why the prayer is, God, help me tell the difference between what I can change and what I can't change, and show. So that is a beautiful appeal to, and however you think of ultimate reality, appeal to the boundlessness within that we are, or if your theology is of a transcendent God. Either way, you're looking somewhere other than your own limited, conditioned understanding for the skill that we all need to discern. Because in Stoicism and in many wisdom traditions, right action begins with accepting these current conditions, not in anger, but in this sense of, well, I'm going to say yes, and then I'm going to start acting. So that is, I think, a really nice way to frame the necessary discernment at the heart of right action. There's a lot of ways to get it wrong, and only a few ways maybe to get it right.
Dr. Goldstein, any response?
Well, I think everything's been said nicely.
Okay, all right. Then let's go ahead to Zoom and make your question please short, because I think we have a lot of questions. We want to try to get as many as possible. So let's go to Zoom question. Can you introduce yourself, where you're from, and then just ask the question?
Pranams, my name is Akshaya in Ann Arbor, Michigan. This is a question for Swami Sarvapriyananda. Pranam, Swamiji. When Bhagwan Ramana Maharishi was asked, how are we to serve others? He said, there are no others. He also said as much as possible not to interfere in the affairs of others. Is anything other than spiritual practice a disservice to the world? Does practicing sadhana until we see no others a form of political action? Alternatively, can peaceful political action be spiritualized or converted into spiritual practice that A, awakens us, and B, builds a just society? What are examples of this kind of action in today's political context?
I think the question was very beautifully put, and the answer is there in the question itself. That you notice spiritual practice until there are no others. Well, that question arises is, what kinds of spiritual practice do you mean? Do you mean just meditation in isolation, or meditation and work, a combination of both meditation, work, and devotion? See, all the yogas, they form different components of a wholesome spiritual life. So action is part of spiritual practice. There are no others. That is a statement of the ultimate truth from an Advaitic perspective, perfectly put. Now, let me put it this way. There are no others. You see only one reality. But with these eyes, in this body and mind, what will you see? You will see exactly what everybody else is seeing. So you will come to a position where you know there are no others. The whole world is one with me. I see myself in all other beings and all beings in oneself. And yet, as far as my day-to-day life goes, I can see myself in this body, and I have a mind, and I can see other people all around me, just like everybody else sees. Now what do you do? So now what you do is bring that knowledge, that realization of oneness into your day-to-day life. Before the realization of oneness, this otherness was the reality. And I am this person and they are really, really all other than me. Some of them I like, some of them I don't like, many are I'm indifferent to. But once we realize this oneness, this becomes more and more clear, I realize there are no others. From the perspective of that oneness, there's nobody that I dislike. And all those, there is nobody who I'm indifferent to. I have a sense of oneness or identification with others. And then action will flow from there. And the action that will flow will always be good action, beneficial action, selfless action.
Anybody like to, Dr. Goldstein, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to just elaborate a little on that. Is that what is the main issue, or at least one of them, that keeps us from immediately recognizing oneness? It's this fixation on our small identity, on this ego, on this self. And so the question was, as Swami really pointed out well, it's a falling on the side of the ultimate in a somewhat dangerous way, to think that there's just at every level that there's no one else out there about whom we ought to care. And so when we do take others just as other people in a very ordinary way, not in a high ultimate realization way, but in a regular relative truth, everyday life sort of way, and we can empathize with their problems and their suffering and try to put ourselves in their place and feel compassion, try to listen, understand, try to figure out by talking with them, how can we help in small ways? That kind of caring and compassion weakens the ego. So that kind of caring and compassion leads in a direct line toward the realization of the oneness that Swami's talking about. And this is why it's very dangerous to fall on the side of, oh, there's no one really out there. There's no other beings we need to care about. Because it's in caring for them that we have a path toward realizing this oneness. So we want to keep both.
Can I add to what
Sure.
Elon just said? Yes, there's overemphasis on the side of the ultimate nature of things, whether it is in Advaita Vedanta or in Mahayana Buddhism. There was a great master in Tibet about 600 years ago, Jes Tsongkhapa, and he is very central to the development of Tibetan Buddhism. One of his contributions on the philosophical side was what can be called a robust sense of the relative truth. He was a monk, and he noticed what was going on in the monastic orders at that time. So he realized that if you emphasize the ultimate nature, the emptiness nature of everything, for example, if you overemphasize that, then from metaphysics, what will happen is you will get nihilism. That what's ultimate reality? Yeah, there's no ultimate reality. You will get that. In epistemology, knowledge, you will get skepticism, that probably we can't know anything at all. And in the realm of values, in the realm of ethics, you will get relativism, anything goes. He says it led directly to moral laxity among the monastic orders. So he brought back this sense of a robust sense of the relative truth, that this world and the teachings of the Buddha and the strict monastic code for the monks, all of these are extremely useful to take you to the ultimate reality. Nagarjuna, over 2000 years ago, in his verses on the middle path, there's a very important verse. He says, the Buddha spoke about two truths. The ultimate truth, which he calls the Paramarthika, same term used in Advaita Vedanta, and the relative truth, which Nagarjuna calls the Samvritti Satyam. In Vedanta, it's called the Vyavaharika, transactional truth, or relative truth. And then Nagarjuna adds, Samvrittim anasritya paramartham nadigamyate. Without the help of the relative truth, no one attains to the ultimate truth. So sense of the relative truth is very important. Vivekananda put it very, very powerfully. He said, one must strive to combine immense idealism with immense practicality.
Thank you. Thank you, Swami Sarvapriyananda. All right, so do we have a question from the audience? Anybody? No? Then let's, okay, Abhay, go ahead. Just come to the front so they can see you. Excuse me.
So my question, it's kind of the same question that's been asked, maybe in a different way. But in Ramakrishna Vedanta tradition, there seem to be kind of two examples that come up that kind of for dealing with our current times in North America, say, being spiritual beings in a political reality, or in a political system. And one is Ramakrishna's teaching to accept God and all beings, but pray to Tiger God from a distance. But the other is also Swamiji's teachings to face the brute about that. And obviously, when you start considering the other as a brute, well, there's other issues, kind of meta issues. But on the day-to-day life as a North American householder, it's tough to know sometimes when to pray to God to withdraw and pray to God, Tiger God from a distance, or when to engage. And it's just like how best to figure out where that sweet spot is when the waters get kind of choppy, as it were. Thank you. Thank you, and pranam.
Peter, would you like to start off with that?
You know, that's another powerful articulation of one of the core themes we've been reflecting on today in this session. It's how do you tell what the right thing in this moment is? And I'm pretty sure that I don't know how to tell. So I continually experiment. One of the first books in Indian wisdom that I encountered was when I was a student at my community college at Ventura College, and my first philosophy and religion professor, Barrett Kalmbach, outside of class recommended, oh, you should read Gandhi's autobiography, which, as many of us know, is subtitled My Experiments with Truth. And that really moved me and it took root in me that that's what the philosophic life is. You know, again, from the Western tradition, Socrates as the sort of starting point, really, of self-inquiry as the core of Western philosophy, said famously that the unexamined life is not worth living. And he's also known for his deep agnosticism, the idea that we just don't know. And the biggest definition of wisdom we get out of the philosophy of Plato, who wrote about his student Socrates, is that idea that wisdom begins in the admission of ignorance. And so for me, always, I don't need all the answers before I pray. I don't need all the answers before I act. Kierkegaard said that life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. And as a Protestant Christian existentialist Danish philosopher, Kierkegaard, I think would agree with me that it's just as good to swap out the word God for life. God is not a problem to be understood, but a reality to be experienced. And so I don't know, and I may never know the best way to proceed, but I do know that I'm morally obligated to proceed. Thank you for all this healthcare here. Appreciate that.
Dr. Goldstein, how would you like to respond to that question?
It is a great and key question. And I'll respond by pointing again toward introspecting with relation to our intention and really getting to know ourselves. When is there some kind of hurt present that wants to lash out and have some kind of retaliation, no matter how subtle? When is there some sort of self-serving desire present in the action that we're contemplating and we're wondering, should I do it? Should I not do it? And learning from our own experience too, right? It's just part of it. And in the absence of this perfect wisdom, like as Peter's pointing out, what are we going to do except rely on our practical experience, but based on introspection? And the more we get to know the functioning of the samsaric side of ourselves, the confused side of ourselves, then we turn it more and more into an ally instead of an enemy. And we don't get fooled so much. So, we're contemplating something, some kind of action that maybe is going to cause a type of conflict. Maybe it's necessary. Maybe there's some court action necessary, or we have to call out someone at work over something, or whatever it may be. And we're not sure, is this worth doing or not? The repercussions. And so we check our intention very carefully. If our intention's off, we need to implement methods to fix that intention. Right? If there's too much clinging involved, we need to use whatever methods we've learned and realize our finitude and the changing nature of everything to give a proper perspective, or whatever the method might be, until we find some sort of balance inside, and then we act with the best intention and our life experience. Kind of simple as that.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go to our next question then. On the internet, go ahead. Indranil, go ahead. Just introduce the person and where you're calling from and ask the question.
Namaste, and thank you so much. It's just, as always, wonderful here listening to everybody else's questions and answers. I heard recently a doctor explaining how when someone has cancer, there have to be 2 points in which it's addressed. One being that you take care of the part of the body that is having a problem. And 2, to make sure the healthy parts of the body are not recruited into disease. So I was thinking this, whether we go to spiritual mentors or to our own spiritual practices, can we see it this way? That when, as a daily practice, when we do it, then we are saying we are preventing the healthy parts from being recruited into a sort of disease, whatever disease, mentally or psychologically. And when we are troubled, when we go to this, we are addressing then that part that is affected. And then I guess we are also learning, are we also learning through spiritual practice to let go of the story and to look at the facts? So even if we are engaged politically, how do we really learn to let go of the story? Maybe we can use our spiritual mentors that way. Would it make sense?
Would anybody like to address that? Swami Sarvapriyananda?
I think Lali's question has the answer in itself. What she said just reminded me there is a quote about effective bosses, in an organization. They said if a boss is indecisive, then in the organization, the boss is not taking the right decisions. So in the organization, the good will suffer, the wicked will prosper, and many who would be good turn wicked. So many who they are recruited on the healthy parts of the body are recruited on the side of the disease in that case. On the other hand, if the boss decisively takes steps, what's supposed to be done, does the job properly, then the good prosper, the wicked come under control, and many who might turn wicked actually turn good. Yeah, so that's the answer. It's already there in your question, I think.
But it added beautifully. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. Anybody else here in the live audience that would like to ask a question? Not? Okay. Zoom, go ahead next into the next one.
Thank you, Maharaj, for arranging this particular forum, and thanks for all the speakers. We see especially in the politics here for the election season coming now, truth is being sacrificed, and people don't really worry so much about it. Looks like all the moral and ethical values seem to be out the door. And also in a wider conflict, in the 2 wars going on, enormous violence on both the sides without any moral compunction. is this a sign of coming of Kali Yuga? Is this what is going to happen? Is going to get worse from here on?
So, do you feel like answering that question, Peter? Is this a sign of the Kali Yuga that the truth is deteriorating in, he's saying, all aspects, and the Kali Yuga is sort of the end of the age?
Yes, I'm fascinated by the entire idea in Indian wisdom scriptures about there being these long ages, and that we are currently in the Kali Yuga, where there is a decline in virtue, where money and fame are confused as virtuousness, where power is misunderstood as righteousness. And as a student of history, I can't find an age that isn't like that. And so I don't know how literal that we want to get about the Kali and all of the other yugas, what, 240, I don't know, all the math behind it. I'm suspicious of all predictions of the future. And as a student of world mythology, there is no doubt a fascination in every single mythic culture, every single culture's mythic expressions. It's the stories it tells itself about itself, including projections into the future. There is, in every case, in all cultures in the world, visions of apocalypse, visions of destruction that lie just up ahead, and that there's not a thing you can do about it, and the world is falling apart. And so as I kind of come at it from maybe a more Jungian or maybe a Joseph Campbell approach, that any culture's mythology tells us more about the people who wrote it than it does about the future. And what purpose flood stories play, and what purpose apocalypse stories play, whether it's Vishnu coming to turn the universe to ash and then recreate it all, or whether it's the Judeo-Christian Islamic God, ending the world and the coming of Christ. All these end times narratives are, to me, powerful stories that we tell that contain these metaphorical truths that all forms arise and all forms fade. And of course, this is going to end someday. But what that means morally, and I don't know about you, but and I'm thinking about the questioner here. I just refuse. It's just my personal decision. I just refuse to submit to defeat, to nihilism, to hopelessness. And I just believe that that is a form of escapism. Any kind of determinism, in my view, robs humanity of our freedom and our dignity and our motivation to serve the suffering right in front of us. Otherwise, I might be tempted to say, well, what's the point? Everything's going to end in ash. Right. Lies have replaced truth. I'm not going to vote anymore in any elections. I'm going to arm myself and store up a bunch of food and get ready. And I'm just like, really? That's why you think we're here? That doesn't sound fun to me.
Thank you. Anybody else like that? Anything to that question?
Can I just make an observation here?
Sure.
Not an answer to Subhashji's question, but something that what he said reminded me of something else. It's interesting that the two problems you mentioned are lies and violence. You mentioned lies and violence. And that reminded me of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote about the Gulag in Soviet times. There he said exactly this thing, the relationship between lies and violence. He says they go together. He says lies are often used to justify violence, and violence is used to protect lies. Yeah, that's just an observation.
I'd like to chime in.
Yes.
That the notion of time and society in general moving in different directions and degenerating. This is not only part of Hindu traditions, it's part of the wider Indian cultural religious understanding. So it's also part of Buddhist understandings. And I'd like to share a little about what some of those Buddhist understandings are in relation to Subhash's question of a increasingly, what is might be perceived as an increasingly degenerate time of difficulties. And as a student of history, it does seem to me that we are living in an age that qualitatively is distinct and different from some previous times that we can study in history. The speed of life is greater now. There's no disputing that. I mean, any society we would find ourselves in 500 years ago, the demands on attention, the number of inputs, the distractions, the momentum, the demands on our time to multitask, do this, do that, answer this email, deal with this. There are more demands and pulls on our attention, and there's a type of speed that goes along with this momentum inwardly that can easily arise. And that is greater now than in times in the past. It's something we have to deal with. I'm going to share two Buddhist insights about this, and it just echoes things that we've talked about previously. There's one saying that comes from a tradition called heart training, of how do we train our hearts in good motivation to try to live a spiritual life while also being engaged in bettering the world, bodhisattva path. And so there is a saying that in English we would say, when the entire world is on fire with the inner poisons, practice the holy dharma of taking on difficulty, being the last, coming back to Swami's talk from Thomas à Kempis, and offering victory and all the best to others. Receive defeat upon oneself, offer the victory to others. This has to be implemented very wisely, but it's about having an orientation of service toward the world and others. Firstly, we don't want to be a doormat where then we hinder ourselves and harm even those that are under our protection. That's not what's being applauded here, but rather it's an ability to not get stuck in our own egos, right? And really keep others foremost in mind. So that's a type of heart motivation practice. But quickly, I want to mention the other side, which is that the Mahayana tantric traditions say that as our time becomes increasingly difficult and chaotic, and emotions are much more rampant, talk of Kali Yuga, that the non-dual teachings, when implemented with particular intelligence, can be especially effective. And here I'm thinking of Vedantic teachings, as part of the non-dual teachings, and not just thinking only of Buddhist teachings. That nowadays, there's a lot of problems, but we're all quite intelligent in general. And the kinds of analysis of realizing that we are not this limited ego in the way it appears. We're not this self-image. We're not this small body and mind. These teachings are accessible to us if we pursue them. And then implementing these kinds of insights about our truer nature, moment by moment, of what is this right now, right here on the Zoom or in the audience? What is the awareness right now? This can be very effective for landing us in a freedom that then enables better action. So that kind of non-dual teaching is applauded for this time. It's like a special antidote for this time. That's a take of Mahayana Buddhism.
Thank you so much. It's now almost 11 o'clock. We have 2 hours. I do want to respect the time with our speakers here, because I think we can go on and on and on. But it's really been a wonderful discussion. It wasn't as controversial as people were telling me it was going to be. It didn't become like Jerry Springer where chairs are being thrown. So I want to congratulate everybody on the respect and dignity that we showed each other, and it was wonderful. I do want to just say one thing, that each of these dignified speakers has certain practices. They teach practices. And I attended Dr. Elon Goldstein's teachings on Dharma. Can you tell us, Dr. Goldstein, what was the place that you were teaching the practices on? You had some courses throughout the year. Was it the Dharma studies? Can you just tell us where that is, and if you'll be teaching courses in coming up?
You know what, Swami? I'm really grateful to be part of this discussion, which is hosted by Vedanta Society, and I feel it's more appropriate to point people back toward the Vedanta Society, which has this superabundance of methods. And so that's what I'd like to do.
Not only is he a great speaker, but he's also very humble as well, as we can see here.
PeterBolland.com.
On the other hand, Peter's is great. He's really wonderful. He's given talks, and he does have this other book that's come out where there are practices. He does meditations, and the book you've written is a wonderful book. What's it called again, Peter?
The Seven Stone Path, an Everyday Journey to Wisdom.
Okay, and so
I humbly offer.
And there's a free workbook also there with exercises on the internet. And we all know Swami Sarvapriyananda's lectures in the Vedanta New York Center. So thank you so much, everybody. I want to thank our moderators. I want to thank Maitri here for getting questions. Also Tejas, who's in South Korea, and it is now approximately probably 3 o'clock her time in the morning there, for being such a good sport and helping. For those that don't know, Tejas has done a lot of work for us in the San Diego Center. It was her strength that helped guide the Asilomar retreat. She was the one that helped me put this whole thing together. And she was supposed to attend, but she couldn't get the visa. And if you've ever come to our spiritual, we do a chaplaincy program, spiritual counseling. She sets up the website, how everything done. So she does a lot of work for San Diego, even though she's in South America. So thank you, Tejas.
Also South America.
She lives in South America. She's visiting South Korea right now. So, but her residence is in.
Where are any of us, really?
So thank you, Tejas, for everything. I want to thank the audience for wonderful questions and just engaging with our speakers here. And in the Vedantic spirit, I'd like to close off with a chant. I'd like to have Dr. Goldstein close off with the Buddhist chant as a way to end off. So Dr. Goldstein, would you like to give us the honor of closing us any Buddhist chant?
Okay, that's unexpected, but sure. And then before I do, I want to say that not only thank you to the distinguished panelists from whom I got to learn, but also to Swami Harinamananda. He is a real inspiration for me, that when I'm tired in my life, as I occasionally am, I think of him quite literally, because besides all of the work in the center, right, he's going through all kinds of education as a spiritual chaplain in the local hospital. He's taking care of his biological family in ways that he's called upon to do. He's very open-minded, and then he puts together these programs from which I and the rest of us all benefit. So real, heartfelt thank you to you, and keep it up. Wow, I don't know if it's because you're young or you're just awesome, but whatever it is, it's great. So sure, I'll do a little prayer, and it's about this bodhisattva path of wishing to combine benefit in the relative ordinary world as much as possible with a higher spiritual awakening that is permanent and eternal and isn't dependent on any changing conditions of the ordinary world. And so in English, it goes along these lines. It says, through the positive force, and then I'll say it I'll sing it in a traditional way, but through the positive force that is activated by the practices that involve effort and intention, and the realization that is effortless of real wisdom, those two, right? The effortful practices of giving and kindness and love and care, the effortless practice of jhana, of real vidya, higher knowing, through the positive force that's activated there, may I achieve full awakening for the benefit of all beings. Right? And this is recited by many Buddhists throughout the world, and it was the way that the prayer was done by Atisha, who lived in the late 900s, early 1000s, who was a great Indian master at Vikramashila, a big university in India, and then traveled all over the world to what is now Indonesia and elsewhere. He was from Bengal originally, and then he brought teachings to Tibet, and they survived through Tibetan Buddhism. And so then the way that it's recited by Tibetan Buddhists all around the world every day is Daki Jinsok Pe Sunam Ki Drola Penchir Sangje Chupar Shok. Through that positive force, may we achieve awakening that brings benefit to ourselves and all others.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Zoom audience. Thank you to our live audience. And with our prayers, let's just pray for peace and harmony, in the world, and guidance, and have respect for one and all. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.